Rotarians and guests, Rotary, as we know, is an apolitical and secular organisation. These are just two of the many things that allow Rotary to do the work we do across countries and across borders. But, as we also know, Rotary has a strong environmental heart. Clean water, sanitation and hygiene education are basic necessities for a healthy environment and a productive life. Thus, I believe Rotary has a duty to see what is happening in our own backyard, to listen to the people at the forefront of the impacts of poor water supply and quality. Just across the border in New South Wales is the Darling River. Once filled with fleets of paddle steamers carrying wool to ships bound for England, for nearly 2 centuries it provided fresh water to farmers seeking to tame our rugged interior and grow much needed food. In January, we all saw the graphic images of mass fish kills in the Darling-Malindi Lake system. 1 million fish died. Early this week, the ABC reported that fruit growers on the lower Darling have begun turning off water to their permanent plantings, been there for years, killing their trees, as they harvest what will be the final citrus crop grown in the valley. The Darling River hasn't flowed for almost a year, and with long stretches completely dried up. Why? How? To share their personal story on the topic of when the river stops running and to discuss the proposition that our dying heartland and future food insecurity is due to government decisions and not drought, please welcome firstly Robert and then the lovely Katherine McBride.
Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you, Adriano and Peter, for the invitation. I guess firstly I'd like to pay my respects to the Kaurna people of which land we're on, and also up our neck of the woods, the Barkinji, because the Barker was the Darling River when we were lucky enough to be kids. Australia's now facing the worst corruption in our history. We have people profiteering out of the destruction of a river system like nowhere else on the planet. Today we stand on 1,500 kilometres of a dry riverbed called the Darling River. Now, a lot of people say a lot of things. Oh, well, it flooded and rains and was dry a lot. Well, I guess our family's only been there 90 years, but a lot of people know the facts, and that's why today we've only got 20 minutes to keep you busy, so we'll keep it pretty simple. But conceivably, we have the misfortune to see what 3 levels of government are doing to us. It is the federal government, the New South Wales government and the Murray-Darling Basin Authority. The states have always argued over water, but South Australia's probably done more than anybody else to work to fix the problems and get very efficient with water. We'll talk about the Malindi Lakes, but as I said, we're right on the Darling River. So to give you a little bit of background on Tulano Station, I think we're the largest privately held block of land in New South Wales at just over 500,000 acres as a husband and wife station. The origins date back to 1851 and before, when the Barkinji used to run the rivers. We're lucky enough to have stories of Waltzing Matilda coming from Tulano Station, the Australian Labor Party, and a lot of other issues that Queensland generally claims, but history will show it actually happened on the banks of the Darling River. Ross Trevor College here in Adelaide is the Reed's Address, and that's where a lot of the wealth came from the Western Division of New South Wales. So to give you some indication, we're equidistant between Broken Hill and Mildura, right at the very, very heart of the lower Darling. The important thing people have to understand is the importance of the Malindi Lakes, and especially to South Australia. Sir Thomas Playford was a very bright individual, a cherry farmer that my father knew, and he understood only too well that if South Australia was to have horticulture and agriculture, it would have to be sustained on the Murray-Darling Basin system. Now, we're on the very lower confines of the Darling River system, but people have got to understand that 40% of your water that's in your glass used to come down the Darling River. Yes, we did have floods, and yes, we did have slow flows, but effectively it was only in 1933-34 that the Darling River actually came to a standstill. These are just 2 pictures of one of the camel trains back in about 1916 at Tulano taking some of the wool away, but you can see the river right beside it. So some people say, oh, the Darling went dry on regular occasions. It went dry at regular occasions on the concept of riverboats. Before white man got there, got to our part of the world, there was 8 natural weirs on the Darling River system. So nature had put weirs in place to guarantee a sturdy water supply coming down the Darling River for a long period of time. We do get floods. I remember one flood very quickly in about 2011, got a flood, and the Air Force rang me up, and at that stage had a few young kids, and they said, you know, what would you like us to drop? And I said, oh, beer. And they said, have you got any families? Oh, yeah, we've got families, young kids, got all of that, but we just want beer. VB, but it's up to you. So we spoke for about 5 minutes, and he eventually kind of got wind that he said, you are landlocked, aren't you? And by the water? And I said, I never said that. So we had a bit of a chuckle. But floods were an integral part, and floodplains are an integral part of the river system. But what was important throughout history was the importance of the Menindee Lakes. As they collapse, South Australian agriculture, we in South Australia are very much dependent on horticulture and agriculture now. A lot of our other businesses have disappeared. So that is why we desperately needed to protect the Menindee Lakes. They were a natural lake system, 4 times larger than Sydney Harbour, and they've been drained twice in 4 years. So if we go on to the next slide, riverboats were everything, and Tolano Station had the largest paddleboat steamer fleet on inland waterways in the southern hemisphere. This is not fiction, this is fact. This is how important riverboats were and how much water was coming down the Darling River. Wilcannia was the 4th largest port in Australia. So for those who like to say at the moment, our river systems are collapsing because of over-extraction, maladministration, greed, corruption, and a number of politicians, both in state and federal politics, who really need to front a Royal Commission firstly, then court system and jail. We do need to see that in this country. This is criminal destruction of an ecosystem that has been around for about 30 million years. As I said, riverboats played an integral part of our lives and allowed everything to come up and down the Darling River. Today, as a young kid, when I bought Tolano Station, it's been in our family. Tolano's been in our family for about 80 years, but Papora in Wyoming, so we've doubled the size, tripled the size over the time that we were there. In my lifetime, I sat on the banks of the Darling River. It was the best protected river system in Australia. We had the Menindee Lakes there, which would guarantee you at least 7 to 8 years' supply of water in a drought. That was how much security we had. And locals, Peter spoke very quickly about the orange growers. They were told back in the 1980s, you have the greatest security of water in the Murray-Darling Basin because you've got the Menindee Lakes. Before white man got there, they filled up in flood, and through the creek system, they'd raise and lower and would guarantee a permanent water supply. And as you know, the Barkindji Nation, Mungo Man's about 100 kilometres down our river, but effectively the oldest skeletal remains on the planet is in the vicinity of the Menindee Lakes, and skeletal remains are all around. So this is the very, very heart of the whole Darling River system. About January this year, a mate of mine, Dick Arnold, and I were in the Darling and saw some of these beautiful fish, and 10 million people around the world kind of asked the question, is this nature? Is this how harsh the Australian climate is? Or would fish 80 or 90-year-old who have been through the millennium droughts and all other droughts, who've survived through that, why are they dying here? And that's the question the world is asking. We've had this week we had the London Times and we had the New York Times basically come to Tolano Station and ask the question. And the people of the world want to know, and you more than ever need to ask the question, why am I holding dead fish? This is not natural. Peter spoke of the 3 million fish that the press of Australia saw, or the public of Australia saw over that few months. I was speaking to the head, one of the head gentlemen of water in New South Wales, who is an expert in this area. Potentially 100 million fish died. 100 million fish. No other man-made natural disaster on this planet has ever transpired to do that much destruction to the environment. Because you not only have that Menindee Lake system collapsing and the 220,000 bird life that visited each year, 121 species of bird life come from all around the world, including some from as far away as Siberia. It's the greatest wetland south of Kakadu. But greed and corruption plays a bigger role in Australia today, and it's very, very disappointing that both our Prime Minister and our Deputy Prime Minister have not bothered to come out. Our Prime Minister will only go as far as Orange. I saw Barnaby in Mildura. New South Wales Premier came out to Wentworth and said, well, okay, that's as close as I get to the action. She was 500 kilometres from the fish kills. We were lucky enough to be instrumental in being part and parcel of working with South Australians to get the Royal Commission up and running initially into the corruption on the river system. You had Brett Walker, who has done an amazing amount of job. And what was great initially, when I first met the gentleman, we were up in Broken Hill, and he had a large community. There was about a couple hundred people saying, well, you know, I'm missing out on those little bluefish and little greenfish aren't here anymore. And I thought, well, this is going to go nowhere. And conceivably, I was lucky enough to sit with him. He took Kat and I and a couple of others, like Badger Bates, who's one of the Buckingie elders, sat us in a room, and I let him have it with both barrels. And Kat's kept on saying, you'll get sued, you'll get sued, you'll get sued. And I said, they're all lawyers anyway, they're QCs. But he took a vested interest. So where we find ourselves today is with a Royal Commission that was damning. It said categorically, there is no science. The Murray-Darling Basin plan has to work, but the Murray-Darling Basin Authority has been put there to destroy every fibre of what the plan is doing. Kat will talk about the New South Wales government. They're white-anting and destroying the river system as quickly as they can. This has to be exposed. South Australia has everything to lose. Your river system is the Murray-Darling Basin. Burke and Will stayed at our place in 1860 because they were looking for the inland sea. With bulldozers, money, corporatisation and government, your $10 billion, we've got a situation where man has created inland lakes in the northern basin, and it will cripple and destroy our river systems into the future. So I'll hand over to Kat. As I said, the South Australian government has passed over the Royal Commission saying, in principle, all okay. Ladies and gentlemen, that Royal Commission is damning. It says you have no future. And if the South Australian government treats it lightly, then we will not have agriculture and we will not have business into the future on the Murray-Darling Basin. Thank you for your time.
Thanks. I'd like to acknowledge that we're on Kaurna country as well and pay my respects to both Kaurna and Barkindji elders, past, present and future. We have learnt so much. It's been such a privilege, particularly in recent years, to learn about our rivers, to learn about our country from those who know it best. Just to go back to some Murray-Darling Basin Plan 101, the plans came out in 2012. It was established after the Millennium Drought because we knew we were taking too much water from our rivers and we needed to return that so that we could have sustainable rivers and healthy communities. Now the plan settled on a figure of 3,200 gigalitres that needed to be returned to the rivers to maintain them. That was far short of what the science said that we needed. Science really said that we needed a minimum of 4,000, but through politics we ended up with 3,200. Now written into the plan were a number of policy structures which said that instead of returning real water from irrigators back into the river, that we could return just over 1,000 gigalitres of that, or 1/3, through finding savings in the way that we deliver water or the way that we do things on farms so that you didn't have those inefficiencies. Menindee Lakes is one of the major, or changes to Menindee Lakes is one of the major proposals under the supply projects. It accounts for 105 gigalitres of that supply project savings. And what we're really concerned about is that the science says that we need to return 4,000 gigs as a minimum, and at the moment we look like we'll only be returning just over half of that. But just giving you some information, background on the Menindee Lakes, as Rob was saying, it's a natural lake system. It's a critical fish habitat for the whole Murray-Darling Basin. So any fishes in the room, the golden perch or the callop, the particularly Menindee Lake and Lake Coundilla, which are the two bottom larger lakes there, are the critical nursery for golden perch right throughout the basin. 80% of those golden perch from all across the Murray-Darling Basin come from Lake Menindee and Lake Coundilla. The Lower Darling is also a critical habitat for or was a critical habitat for the Murray cod. It was one of the few places where there were natural flows and therefore they could spawn and breed, which we've lost on the Murray because of locks. In the 1950s and 60s, it was developed with some structural works to optimise the conservation of water in the lakes so that it could be a storage, and it became a key supply for South Australia in conjunction with Lake Victoria. The water that is in the lakes is a shared resource between New South Wales, Victoria and South Australia. And what is also critically important is that whatever flows into Menindee Lakes determines South Australia's allocation of what we get across the border. So when water does not come down the Northern Basin and enter Menindee Lakes, then South Australia is losing out. What's also important is, particularly in summer, on the Murray, they have huge constraints getting water down through irrigation areas, and therefore having water coming down the Darling is critical to be able to supply that water in South Australia during summer. So what the New South Wales Government is proposing under the Murray-Darling Basin Plan is to save water from natural lakes. This is to reduce the evaporation from the lakes. Now, the Murray-Darling Basin Authority approved this project back in 2018, even though their own reports stated that there had been no environmental impact statement conducted and there has been very little environmental work done to understand the impacts of this. They haven't addressed the risks and impacts to downstream users, including those on the Lower Darling, such as ourselves as pastoralists, and it raises significant concerns about the reliability of supply and the water quality. There's a huge impact potential for adverse ecological impacts. The lakes will be much, much drier than in natural occurrences, and that's particularly devastating for those golden perch where that nursery is. There are also huge questions about what will happen. The New South Wales Government has done some environmental projects on the Darling and Anna Branch in the past, and those benefits will be lost. And a critical part is that of the MDBA approving these projects is that they must show environmental equivalence. They must not have detrimental environmental impacts. And the project does not meet the MDBA's own framework for testing against environmental equivalence. Our calculations are that the Lower Darling will be dry approximately 80% of the time if this project goes ahead. I've said that in front of senior New South Wales bureaucrats and MDBA staff, and no one has disputed that fact. Meanwhile, what's happening upstream of Menindee? As Rob was saying, the New South Wales Government have pushed through a number of changes in the way that water can be managed. We have concerns with other states as well, but being in New South Wales, that has been our focus. One of those changes which has been on the radar is the Barwon-Darling water sharing plan and the changes that were made in 2012. And that was what Four Corners came out with 2.5 years ago in that headline story, What's Killing the Murray-Darling Basin. Basically, those rule changes allowed that in a low river or low flows, irrigators could have significantly larger pumps and more of them. And importantly, they could pump that water into a dam and store it. Previous to that, it had to be used immediately onto a crop, and therefore it was really just for finishing off crops in the heat of summer. This meant that they could store it for multiple years, and that's what they've done. They also handed out a significantly larger amount of water licences and allow allocation of water to be carried over. So right now, 2,000 gigalitres of water can be taken from the Barwon-Darling, which is 450% of their annual allocation. If they can't pump it in dry years, when we get some water, they can pump it, and that is still allowed. There have been a number of reports that have come out about these 2012 rule changes, and these show that The changes sent the Darling into a hydrological drought 3 years earlier than what we should have seen with if natural flows had occurred, and that these changes were a major factor in the fish kills in January. Another serious policy change that we're seeing in New South Wales is floodplain harvesting. The New South Wales government is handing out and licensing floodplain harvesting. For those who don't know, basically what you do is you go and build a huge levee bank. Some of these are 10, 20 k's long, and then when a flood comes, you hold all that water back and you slowly pump it into your dams instead of letting it flow into the rivers. Now, this is critical because as a river, we obviously need low flows, but we also need those high flows to go out and preserve the floodplain country further down. So we need to make sure that those floodwaters are actually getting into our rivers. New South Wales government are handing these licences out based on what people have done historically. There is no science in how they are allocating it, and no modelling has been done to understand what impact it will have on our rivers. It also hasn't been factored in to that amount that we need. It has been defined as sustainable under the Murray-Darling Basin Plan. So we have no understanding of what this will be. We believe it will be devastating, as do many others. So, as Rob was saying, irrigators on the lower Darling are now turning off their citrus crops and watching them die. They're picking right now. This will have a huge impact for those people. I mean, these are businesses that have been running for 100 years. But we're going to see that impact in South Australia and South Australian irrigators because, as I was saying, if that water can't come down the lower Darling, then it has to come down the Murray. And right now, we actually can't put enough water down the Murray in peak periods of summer to get it to the South Australian border because that demand has been picked up in New South Wales and Victoria, and there have been huge crops going in the last couple of years in those areas. So South Australia will lose out. And just finally, what do we really need? Well, if it comes down to two things, we really critically need a federal Royal Commission into the Murray-Darling Basin. The South Australian Royal Commission has started to unearth it, but unfortunately the Commissioner did not have the powers to compel witnesses from interstate or federal government, and therefore we haven't been able to get to the bottom of it. We need to get to the bottom of this to be able to build a system that protects our communities and our environment going forward. Secondly, we need the South Australian government to commit to maintain and protect Menindee Lakes and not allow that water savings project to go ahead because it will devastate the environment, but it will also have a huge impact on South Australia and South Australia's potential to be able to access water. Thank you.
I'll swap places with you, and I'll swap places with you. Indeed, Katherine and Rob, thank you. We've got time for a couple of questions, and there's a couple of hands, but I'm going to pull rank as usual. I'm going to ask the first one. There's a number of us in the room, Stephen Haynes, myself and others, who have got children living in overseas countries who can't purchase land in the country they're residing in. How the bloody hell can China buy so much land in the areas that feed our state and our territory that you're talking about?
China's increased their holding of land in Australia tenfold in the last few years. Now, if you were looking at this clinically, if you kill our river systems, the only thing we have in Australia left is farmers. You kill our river systems, you'll kill us, and the Chinese are already moving in. Food is critically important on the planet. Like never before, we have had generations of English, Americans, everybody coming in through the world, getting money, etc. Now it's food security above all else. Suicide rates in Australian farmers have doubled in New South Wales in the last few years. They're actually staging their own deaths, so work cover cases are going through the roof because farmers have had enough. They cannot cope with what's going on. Australians are net importers of dairy this year. You're importing grain from overseas. The Murray-Darling Basin feeds 40 million and it's collapsing. We're the first sign. You had all the water in the last few years here because New South Wales wanted those lakes empty because they want water up north. It's a very bad situation that we find ourselves in, and Australians more than ever, We're very honoured that Rotary have had us here. It's about service and it's about community. We are facing Armageddon at the hands of our own government. So that's a good question to ask, Peter. And I guess the question is, Australians have to wake up to themselves damn quickly or we won't have a future.
Thanks, Rob. Chris Mishamore was the first hand up. Microphone right behind you. It's on.
Firstly, thank you for a fantastic presentation, both of you. Easily the most passionate presentation we've had here for many a year. And thank you. And of course, not only passionate, but very much shows the knowledge that you have of the system. My question is, I wonder if you can tell us how much influence and how much power the South Australian government has to influence, really influence what happens on the Menindee Lakes.
Yeah, so South Australia actually has a significant amount of influence because of those agreements that were set up and that water sharing arrangement. So if South Australian government says no, one of the major changes is changing the rules of how that water sharing agreement is set up. That was established in 1914. So if South Australia says no, then the project can't go ahead in its current form. So quite a bit of influence.
And so one other point to harness that was the South Australian Royal Commission. We did call the Murray-Darling Basin Authority and the Commonwealth employees. The Prime Minister stopped the Commonwealth employees for coming and the Murray-Darling Basin Authority refused. But it went to the High Court and they said if you have a federation of states, then they must turn up. But unfortunately at that time we went through an election and unfortunately the South Australian government took it upon themselves to stop funding a Royal Commission. All up the South Australian Royal Commission spent $5 million. US taxpayers have spent close to $10 billion already and everything relies on it. So South Australia needs to stand up. Sir Thomas Playford used his mind a long time ago to start protecting South Australia. This government has to stand up against the Federal Liberal National Party and say South Australia has to win, else if no water starts coming over the border, the Murray's going to look very much like the Darling in a few years' time.
One last quick question, and I'm sorry, but Pat Christie had his hand up first. A quick question, Pat, and a quick answer.
I'm not going to ask a question, I'm going to make a statement. I was trained...
Questions, no statements. Hold the microphone that way.
How's that?
No, that's right.
No good? No. Okay.
Right angles, Pat. That's it. People can hear you.
Can you hear me?
No, we can't.
Okay. I was trained in the United States Bureau of Reclamation in the 1950s. It's the biggest irrigation and dam building organisation in the world. It has built 600 dams in the western United States. It supplies irrigation water to 12 million acres of farmland. It supplies over half the vegetable crop used in the United States, about a third of the nut crop used in the United States, and they are a very effective, successful organisation. And you take the Colorado River, it has 7 state governments involved. Where is the final responsibility? That's the only way we'll solve it. President Trump or the President of the US is the final arbiter on what happens. And he's just declared a state of emergency in the Colorado Basin and a drought emergency. Thank you.
Thanks, Pat. As Tony Jones says, I'll take that as a statement on Q&A. Rotarians and guests, we've been very privileged today, and a quick wind-up. As a little tacker, I spent a lot of time on the Menindee Lakes. We journey 50-odd mile down from Broken Hill. It's a wonderful part of the world, and it's a travesty to see what's happening. But it's almost the symbolic of what's happening to our country and what these two wonderful people and the daughter Kate is out there talking to the world about. We ought to support it. Robert, Katherine, thank you so much for your time. As a recognition, we present you proudly a certificate of appreciation and a donation is going to be made in your name to end polio.
Thank you very much, Bill. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. Adrian and Peter, thank you so very, very much on behalf of our family. We're honoured to be here. We thank Rotary. We know it's about society being a better place going forward, and that's what Rotary really wants. It's selflessness, not self. And from our perspective, we're humbled to be here. Please take this message back, and any other organisations, any time we can help or talk on behalf, we'd be very, very honoured. So thank you for your time.
Thank you. Your glasses.